Mark Meckler, great to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Great to be with you.
So, I've been sitting nearby this, your Lamborghini, actually. It's not what I expected to find at Turning Point USA. But you're using it as a kind of way to get people interested in your issue, which is the Convention of States. And it's a bit of a controversial issue from what I've gathered from talking to different people. I just wanted you to tell me, what is this all about?
Well, so back in 1787, to go way back in history, at the convention, the founders knew that eventually the federal government would become too big, oppressive, as they said, and would overtake the states. And they wanted to give us, the people, a mechanism to push back against that. So 2 days before the end of the convention, September 15, 1787, Colonel George Mason addressed the assembly, and he asked this question: are we so naive that we believe that a government, a federal government that becomes a tyranny, will ever propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? And if not, we need to give the people acting through the states the ability to do so.
Interesting.
It's interesting because Madison's notes, which are very thorough, say that the debate was nin com, meaning no comment in Latin. That was short for Latin for no comment, right? So there was no debate. The founders all agreed we had to give the states a way to push back. So here we are, 243 years later. Pretty much everybody agrees. 72% of Americans say the federal government's too big and does too much. The folks in D.C. are not going to ever restrain themselves. They're not going to pass a balanced budget amendment. They're not going to impose term limits on themselves. So Article 5 allows us as states to call a convention when 34 states request it, to get together to propose amendments to restrain federal tyranny. That's what we're doing. It takes 34 states. So far, 15 states have made that application.
Okay, so that's really interesting. But so the fear, I think, out there that I've heard from numerous people is that this kind of a motion could actually, amend the Constitution, which would be a potentially very dangerous thing, right? What are your thoughts?
Well, first I would say it's in the Constitution. So are we constitutionalists or not? Do we support the full use of the Constitution or not? And I would argue that those who argue against this do not support the Constitution. It's not a pick and choose kind of a document. And this is just something they pick out and they don't like and they're scared of it. The question is really, from my perspective, on where's the fear come from? And I will tell you where it comes from. It comes from people on the right that have been unintentionally co-opted by the radical left. Because this idea of what you're describing is called a runaway convention comes from the radical left. It was invented by Chief Justice Warren Burger. He's the guy who was Chief Justice when we got Roe versus Wade. His signature is on it. He came up with this idea of a runaway convention because the states were pushing back against Roe versus Wade, passing Article 5 applications, and he got asked about what he thought about that. Well, Roe versus Wade was his baby. It is the seminal decision of his legal career. So naturally, he said it's a terrible idea to hold a convention. They then enlisted professors from Harvard and Yale, leftist professors, to write articles against the idea of a convention of states potentially being a runaway. That idea of the runaway convention never existed in American history before this. And fast forward to today, about 2 years ago on Good Friday, every single, and that sounds like a big word, every single leftist group in America, major leftist group that you could name, signed a press release opposed to the Convention of States, saying that we were trying to reverse 115 years of progressivism. And normally I don't agree with the left, but that is true. That is what we're working on. So the left today, Soros orgs on down, Common Cause, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, La Raza, Planned Parenthood, every public employee union in the nation, all of these organizations are aligned with a very few people on the fringe of the right that are opposed to the idea of a Convention of States.
Okay, what would the Convention of States and how is it impossible that this runaway convention would happen? Because this is you're basically saying this is a fantasy, the runaway convention.
It's absolutely a fantasy, yeah. Well, or a nightmare fantasy, how's that?
Okay.
So here's what the convention can do. Every state is passing the same application. The application says that in convention, the convention can discuss and propose amendments that deal with 3 subject matter areas. One is anything that would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. That would include a balanced budget amendment supported by about 85% of the American public. It would include things like the imposition of generally accepted accounting principles on the federal. They use, I don't know, like M&Ms and Skittles to do their accounting right now. We need real accounting principles so we know what the actual debt is, what they're actually spending. It would include things like taxing and spending caps on the federal government, or maybe preventing the federal government from imposing unfunded mandates on the states. Second, it would include anything that would impose term limits on federal officials. This includes on Congress themselves, supported again by about 85% of the American people. Congress is never going to limit their own terms. It would include imposing imposing term limits potentially on staffers and bureaucrats as well. We never intended for folks to be in DC for 30 years living off the hog there. And the last is it would potentially impose term limits on the federal judiciary, which I personally think is really important. We were never supposed to have Supreme Court justices sitting for 30 years or federal judges for 30 years. And then finally, and I think most importantly, it would impose scope and jurisdictional restrictions on the federal government, like telling the federal government, no, you may not be involved in education. That's actually unconstitutional. No, you may not be involved in healthcare. So energy, things that the federal government has really overstepped the bounds of enumerated powers. Now, every state that says they want to participate in this has passed a resolution saying that's what we're going to talk about in convention. So that's how you set the rails for convention. Now, you asked about, like, well, can it run away? Can they exceed the authority? And the answer is no. I'll start with the end, and then we can dig into details.
So what is the authority, and how does the types of reforms that you're describing get actually implemented into law?
Okay, so the authority is set by these resolutions that are passed by the states. The states then each pick their own delegation, right? Each state gets one vote, but they can send as many delegates as they want. And the delegates only have the authority given to them by the states, which is given in the resolution, which has been passed by their legislature. So some people will say, well, they're going to get to convention, Jan, and they're going to do whatever they want. I hear this regularly. It belies human nature, first of all, because the legislatures are going to choose people that they trust. They're going to tell them what their authority is, and the idea that they would just go there and do whatever they want doesn't make sense. But let's say I'm wrong. Let's say it runs away and they do. The one I hear most often, Jan, is that they're going to do away with the Second Amendment. And so now let's imagine 26 states, that's what it takes in convention, say, well, we want an amendment to do away with the Second Amendment. Now that amendment has to go back out to the states for ratification. I've traveled the states. I've been in literally 48 states in the last 3 years. And if you go out to the states and you go to the most conservative states, it takes only 13 states to stop any amendment, right? The inverse of the 38 to ratify. If you go out to the most conservative states, say Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Texas, where I live, you tell them you want them to take up an amendment to take away their guns, I think you need to be carrying a weapon in that legislature. And by the way, 15 legislatures allow you to carry your weapon into the legislature. And so the idea that you could lose something like that, or there aren't 13 states to stop anything that you or I wouldn't like, it's literally, as you said, that's just a fantasy.
Interesting. So you say right now there are
15 states have passed it. So
15 states have passed it.
So 2 more will hit the halfway mark.
And you're basically, your whole goal and raison d'etre is to just kind of keep getting more states on board.
Yeah, I would add something, because there is a meta goal for me. You know, I'm a grassroots activist at the heart. This is what I've been doing for 10 years. I think even if we got to convention and passed proposed amendments and then ratified them, we could still lose the country unless we raise up a self-governing population. The founders told us that if the population didn't pay attention to what was going on and be engaged, we would lose our country. And so what we are doing is building the largest self-governing grassroots army in American history. Today, over 4 million people are involved in this movement. We have people in every single state and congressional district in the country. And so the goal is to build up this grassroots base all over the country that understands how their government works and is actually engaged in the working of their government.
You know, you've actually been doing this kind of thing a bit longer, right? You were involved in the Tea Party movement back in 2010 or 20...
Started in 09
right.
and through 10 and up until the elections in 12.
Right. So I guess, does the Tea Party movement still exist? I don't even know. It's sort of, where are things at?
I would say no, not as a movement. And I actually think that's a good thing. And before people get angry with me, let me explain why. So as one of the guys that helped found the largest organization, the Tea Party Patriots, with my co-founder, Jenny Beth Martin, here's why I say that. Because a successful political movement, by its very nature, should cease to exist at some point.
Okay.
Because if you don't, then you're just people screaming in the streets. When a movement ceases to exist, generally, is when it has inculcated itself into a system of governance. In 2010, we elected the largest swing class in the history of the House of Representatives since 1938. In 2012, the Tea Party movement helped take the Senate. I would argue that President Trump is sort of the end of the long spear of the Tea Party movement. I wouldn't say he's a Tea Party guy per se, but if you look at all the ideas that were required to be expressed to get up there, Marco Rubio was a Tea Party candidate, Rand Paul was a Tea Party candidate. A lot of these folks came out of the Tea Party. Mike Lee is a Tea Party candidate, Ted Cruz. So all of these ideas are now inside of our system of governance. A lot of people I came up with are political consultants, they're candidates, they're serving on school boards, state legislatures, and all the way up into the U.S. Senate.
Very, very interesting. So mission accomplished. Time to move on. There'll be another movement that comes along.
Yeah, I think
right?
so. And I actually think that Convention of States is the next movement. And here's why. Because the thing that we were missing in the Tea Party movement was an actual plan. And look, I'm responsible for this, at least partially. We had no idea what we were doing. You know, contrary to the narrative on the left, we were just a bunch of grassroots activists. My background is as an attorney. I'd never been engaged in politics. We had no idea how the political system worked other than what we learned in school, right? You elect good people, they go to DC and they do good things. We didn't understand the deep state. We didn't understand the power of incumbency, any of this stuff. So now that we've now learned this stuff, you have to have a better plan. The plan is to call a Convention of States, because the problem in DC today is not personnel, it's structure. So now the Convention of States project is designed to deal with the structural problems we've created in our government in Washington, D.C., and to fix those structural problems.
With respect to the Tea Party movement, I was telling you a little bit offline. You know, the head of our Orange County office is an Iranian fellow. He was going to go do a presentation with the Tea Party organization. He had a bit of trepidation. Right. He had heard, there might be some, possible racism or something in these groups. He went over and he came back and told me, no, these are the most welcoming, amazing, friendly people. It's very. How is it that there seems to be this kind of stigma, and I don't even know where it came from. I had it in my head as well. I haven't believed it for years, right. but where does this come from?
This is the left-wing media in America imposing this on the Tea Party movement. And we dealt with it a lot when we were raising up the movement. And you would read articles about accusing us of racism, accusing the Tea Party of being racially based. I still hear it today, by the way. I spoke at UC Berkeley about 3 months ago. The last question of the day was, now isn't it obvious in hindsight that the Tea Party movement was all based on racism, right? And so it's still out there. It was done as a way to damage what was the most powerful political movement at the time. So it was purely political motives by the media intended to damage the movement. I'll give you one of the most specific examples. During the height of the Tea Party movement, they were trying to pass Obamacare, the Democrats were. And the Democrats in the House of Representatives pulled a stunt. There were tens of thousands of people who were protesting in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. Nancy Pelosi, Elijah Cummings, and some others, a bunch of members of the Black Caucus in the Democratic Party, marched straight through that demonstration, carrying a gavel, right? This is around the time Nancy Pelosi said she was going to get it done, over the wall, through the wall, around the wall, whatever, right? And they claimed that they were spat upon by Tea Partiers. The Black Caucus was spat upon by Tea Partiers. Never happened, right? And Andrew Breitbart, God rest his soul, amazing guy, was there, and he offered a $10,000 reward for anybody who could provide video footage of that. Now, there are a lot of people with iPhones out and other kinds of phones recording this whole thing. It didn't happen. But these were incidents that were made up by the mainstream media, by the politicians on the left to try and vilify the Tea Party movement. None of it ever happened. And I would say to anybody who's watching this that doubts what I'm saying, it is a miracle, by the way. Like millions of people, nobody did something really stupid. Go do your research on the internet. Try to find the racial incident by a Tea Party leader or by a Tea Party group. You literally can't find it online today, and you can find almost anything online.
And you were also you actually told me offline, I thought this was really interesting. You guys actually had a strategy to deal with people that might have this, might be coming in trying to cause trouble and so forth.
Yeah, and we had heard that the left was going to send people to our meetings, to our protests, and have them hold up racially offensive signs and things like this. And so what we instructed everybody is to have people at your event with signs on sticks that said, this person is not a member of the Tea Party. And so if you got somebody who's held up a swastika or whatever, you would just immediately surround them with these signs. The person couldn't be seen, first of all, and generally they would just leave. And so they were just not welcome. And we made sure everybody knew that kind of thinking, that kind of talking, those ideas were not welcome in the Tea Party movement.
That's fascinating. You have to kind of, I just came back from Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, there's a lot of allegations and, some video footage definitely showing that there's, people that are aligned with the Hong Kong police, possibly with the Communist Party of China, that are kind of amidst the protesters. So it's not.
Yeah, I would say, if I could advise them, that would, and if you talked, that would be a great strategy. Just make sure there are always people around with signs that say this person is not part of the democracy movement. And so that way you can call those people out, separate them out, because this is always a tactic of the left, right? When the left wants to impose negative imagery on folks who are freedom fighters, they always want to make us appear violent or radical or crazy. And so they will put people into our organizations and into our crowds to make it appear that way. They get their video footage, and then that's what they spread around. And I have no doubt that that's going on in Hong Kong.
Okay. Mark Meckler, such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Go to conventionofstates.com, press the button, sign the petition. More importantly, get 10 of your friends to do the same. When you sign the petition, then that sends a letter to your state legislator. You go on the list in their district as a supporter. We deliver those lists to the state legislators. It means something to them.